We talked a little bit about the notion of the mind and of integration. A couple of other additional things I think it's just important for us to bear in mind as we think about the hope that we're discovering in some of this work that we're talking about. One has to do with the notion of neuroplasticity. Some of you are probably well versed in this at this point. When I was in medical school 30 years ago, we didn't really know much about it. We didn't really think that the brain could change much. Now we think that it can change quite a bit. There's a number of things that you can, if you want your mind and your brain to change, then something is going to have to fire differently neuroplastically. Gosh, I have never had someone who is so young pay this much attention to me. Right? He's how old is he? He's 1. Oh my goodness. Okay. Right. Amazing. Okay. So, So there are some things that you can do to enhance neuroplasticity, right? And some of these things we want to encourage our clients to do. We want them to be exercising aerobically. We want, oh gosh, I can see. He and I are just going to go have a private session. I'm going to talk to him about my problems. And so aerobic, like diets, right? I don't mean by diet, I don't mean go on a diet. I mean that we as Americans in general eat too much and we eat too fast. Right, that's number 2. There are lots of other details about this. Number 3, we talk about sleep. On average, we sleep about 2 hours less per night than we did 100 years ago. Not helpful for us, especially with the new data arriving around obstructive sleep apnea and development of Alzheimer's disease and so forth. Another one is the degree to which we are engaged in creative novelty. What are people doing to actively be engaged in acts of creativity, whether that means taking a painting class or that means learning a new language, so forth and so on. All these things that we could be doing differently, that creative novelty. And of course, again, we can't give people what we don't have. Another one is mindfulness practices, whether that's meditation, whether that's centering prayer, whatever those kinds of things might be. Another one happens to be, interestingly enough, some new ones on the horizon that have come up in the research recently. One is humor. Right? The more actively we engage in exposing ourselves to humor, right? So like going to comedy clubs. I mean, I suppose we would want them to be of the kind that are going to be helpful for us, but like we want to be able to laugh, right? That's number 1. Another one, though, is deep reading. And by this, I don't mean accounting textbooks, although I'm sure that there are accountants here. You find that to be terribly interesting, reading those textbooks. But I mean, War and Peace would probably be very difficult to publish now, because we have such a hard time reading for long periods of time. But one of the things that deep reading does, long, good novels, it really forces us to stay in one train of attuned attention for long periods of time. We are being trained to not pay attention to things for long periods of time, actively trained to not do that. And then lastly, I would want to say that, again, being engaged in meaningfully connected human relationships are what enhance neuroplasticity, right? This question of being known, this question of people asking me questions that I'm not even thinking of being asked. Kind of like the questions that I asked our friend Steve. Because when we ask him this question of like, well, tell me about your home life, at first, he, of course, doesn't think that it has any relevance to why he's there. It's not until he starts to understand some of the science that he begins to understand that telling the story of his story actually mobilizes his brain, actually enhances his neuroplasticity. If he wants his depression to be different, if he wants his direction of his attention, therefore taking with him what he senses and feels neuroplastically, then that's going to be important to pay attention to. One of the things that we know that attention does, attention is what drives neuroplastic change. I said earlier, what we pay attention to, we become. What we become, in that sense, what we remember becomes our anticipated future. But we also talked to Steve about emotion. Now, Steve was a science guy, and Steve was a man of facts. Steve was a man of information. Steve was a man who wanted to talk about data. And data was hugely important. But Steve didn't see any relevance whatsoever to the notion of feelings. until we started to talk about this idea that emotion really is the energy around which the brain organizes itself. If you were to read The Healing Power of Emotion, one of the books in the Library of Interpersonal Neurobiology that Norton publishes, you'll see there are 8 different experts on the field of study of emotion. And they have 8 different takes on what emotion actually is. But one thing that they agree on, they agree that if you take emotion out of the human equation, human beings will stop. They stop moving. We stop doing things. It's important to know that emotion is like the fuel in a car. It's like the gas in the tank. There's nothing that you do in your car that is not a function of fuel regulation. You want to back your car out, you want to move your car forward, you want to turn your car on, you want to go down the street, you want to go faster, slower. Everything has to be in terms of regulating fuel. But it's important to know that just because we say that doesn't mean that emotion is the most important thing in the car. We don't build cars just to have a place to store gasoline. But it's hugely important. So we ask the question a lot, what are you feeling? And we have to be clear with folks, right? Because many people will say, well, I feel that you're being an idiot, right? That's not really what I'm not asking. That's a thought. That's an assessment. I'm really asking the question, what is the emotion that is emerging from you? Because whatever that emotion is the thing that if you are not choosing to regulate it, it will regulate you. That's exactly what will happen. And it's happening all the time. And so we invited Steve to do this. And as Steve began to do this, he became aware of a lot of things that were true about his life that were contributing to his state of mind, his depression as it showed up. And over the first probably 6 to 8 weeks, his depression started to mobilize, but not just because, his antidepressant was effective. It began to mobilize because he was talking about a storyline. He was engaged in the traumatic events of his life that he had for 30 years stayed away from. Now, for those of you who are here when we were talking about shame, one of the things that we say is that, if you have afflicting emotional states, right? You had, for Steve, it was the emotional state of being ashamed of what it was like to be really interested in science and have his parents terminally tell him no, over and over and over again. Essentially, they weren't talking, as far as he was concerned, they weren't talking with him about science, they were talking with him about him. It's not just that science is dangerous, it's that you are dangerous. And of course, this evokes all kinds of things in him that he feels. Shame and guilt and anger and so forth and so on, that of course he's not really able to talk about. Until he starts to talk about it with me. And then at one point I said, Steve, he was in his 50s, but his parents were still alive, and we started to talk about what it might be like for him to consider having these conversations with his parents, which he wasn't about to do initially. But one of the things I did say was that, we're now at a point where you and I are talking about things, and you're on an antidepressant, and your mood is better, and you're not thinking in terms of despair anymore. But one thing that's not happening is that you're not really having much of a connection with anybody else outside your own storyline. He's talking to me, but he's not talking to anybody else. And so we invited Steve to join a group that we were running in our practice. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Just to highlight what I know that a lot of people are doing here in your work, whether you're doing work in trauma or otherwise. One of the things that we're recognizing is that in the same way that trauma never happens trauma happens in some kind of social context, in some way, shape, or form. Healing also, in its most powerful forms, always happens in a social context. In its most powerful forms, healing takes place in the context of me not just being known by a singular other as the therapist, but what would it look like for Steve to actually enter into a group setting in which he's telling not just me his story, but he's telling other people his story, which of course Steve thought was a really bad idea. Here's the thing. You may or may not know this. The psychoanalysts will tell you this all the time, that the moment that psychotherapy begins between you and a patient, despite the fact that the patient appears to be there for health and appears to be there to tell you the whole truth, one of the things that that patient will immediately begin to do is they will begin to hide from you. They will begin to find ways to not tell you everything that they tell you that they want to tell you, but they don't. They will look for ways to outflank you. Now, they don't necessarily know that they're doing this, but here's the thing. If I'm depressed, in no small part, it's going to be because at some level, because I've avoided intimacy in some way, shape, or form in my life. There are parts of me that feel broken, parts of me that feel ashamed, parts of me that feel traumatized, a whole range of things that if you start to walk into that space, it is unnerving. Does that make sense? And so despite the fact that I'm here to talk to you, I'm also afraid to talk to you. And there will be parts of me that will be feeling both of those at the same time. And this is true of a kid, right? The kid wants to tell the parent the truth, but they're afraid to tell the parent the truth. This is happening all the time. And so what will often happen, whether you know it or not, is that you and your patient will start to develop common blind spots. There will be things that you will say to them that they won't listen to. There will be things about them that you won't see or hear. And so one of the beautiful things about inviting someone to join a group is that there are more eyes and ears involved in this. So for Steve and me, who I'd come to like a great deal, for Steve to enter into a group, he's now not just going to have to keep track of me, he's going to have to keep track of 8 other people. But the beautiful thing is this, is that he's not just going to keep track of 8 other people, 8 other people are going to keep track of him. 8 other people are going to be in a position in which each of them feel something different. Each of them feel aligned to him. Each of them evokes things with him. And so one of the things I tell Steve is like, look, you're actually coming into a place where you're going to get actually a lot more help than you're getting from me. Because so many more people are serious about doing this work. So one of the things I want to invite us to consider is that when we feel like a person is ready, it's never a bad idea to think about the construction of group processes in which they can take advantage of even doing work at a higher level. And that's what we're finding in our work. And so there's 2 ways in which I tell people that things are going to be advantageous for them. One is this notion that there will be other people who will see and hear things that I don't see and hear. But here's the other thing. Now, I don't know what it's like for most of us here who are working with clients, but most clients, at the end of the day or at the end of a week or 5 years of work with them, most of them are not going to have an acutely aware sense of how they have really been helpful for you, the clinician. Would that be fair to say? Because they're not there to help you. You're there to help them. They're there to get help from you. Does that make sense? But here's the thing. In a group, what I tell patients is look, the group is not just going to be helpful for you, but you are going to be helpful for the group. You see, one of the things that people need when they are broken is that they do need to have a sense that they can still be helpful for someone else even in their brokenness. We do need to have a deep sense that my brokenness is not malignant. That even my brokenness in and of itself has the opportunity to be helpful and healing. And this is exactly what happens in groups, because I tell people, some folks they want to go to groups because they're sure that they're there to help everybody else in the room. You know what I mean? But what I tell them is it's important for you to know that the other group members are not going to benefit from your insight and wisdom and suggestions and recommendations and so forth, although that may be true. They may be benefit, but what they're mostly going to benefit from is your vulnerability. They're going to benefit from the fact that you are willing to allow yourself to be known by them. And in your telling them your story, especially the part of your story that is broken, you evoke within them parts of their story that they don't know that they don't know. Are you with me? We can't give people what we don't have. And so my question would be, who are the people with whom you are also in community, whereby which the same thing is happening for you that you are inviting others to do? What we're finding in these groups is something that I would say then gets reflected, okay, I'm going to say this in 2 minutes, and then I'm going to be done. We're going to start Q&A because we're going to be out of here at 3 o'clock. Where's my, right? That's what we said. Okay. I'm just going to say this. So in the fourth verse of the 27th Psalm, we read the following. There's one thing that I've asked the Lord, one thing I asked, that I will seek after all the days of my life, that I will dwell in the house of the Lord, that I will gaze upon his beauty, and that I will inquire in his temple. And I want to suggest that in the context of our communities, what we're calling these confessional communities of healing, that these three things happen. We dwell, we gaze, and we inquire. The first thing is that we dwell. Right? To dwell, to live, means that we are going to do the hard work of not leaving the room, that we are going to spend the time that is necessary over time. And much of the healing work that we'd like to have done in our culture, we'd like to have it done in about 6 weeks. We'd like to have it done in maybe about six days. But like, I think I would just come and have a consultation with you, and after that, like, I'm done. Like, I think we could, because I've heard great things about you, Jan, and I just think that that's going to be great. Right? So, we dwell, which means this. The work that you do takes a long time to do. The work that you do takes a long time to do. We dwell. We gaze. We look. We don't glance. We don't blink. We gaze. And to gaze on each other's beauty is not just to gaze at that which at first glance we would always take it being beautiful, because I will tell you how many of us, and it was true for Steve, the whole notion that he was going to reveal his story to people that he didn't know, little by little by little by little, only to come to find out that as he did so, they offered him mercy and compassion, the likes of which he had never known before. And of course, you know how it is, for those of you who are in our talk, and I was telling you about my story about my son, you know, the thing about shame is that, you know, you can do something for which you're ashamed, and you then go to the person and you ask for forgiveness, and they say, well, we're good, we're fine, like I did with my son, but you don't think you're done, right? You got to come back and ask again and again and again. And, you know, people say, well, I still feel guilty. And I say, well, that's not guilt, that's shame, right? Your continual felt. And this is the thing for Steve, right? He continually felt shame about somehow how it was that he, with all of his science, didn't have what it took to keep his son from killing himself. Because Steve had to keep hearing over and over and over and over again from this group of people that they really wanted him in the room despite what they knew of him. Because his story was only going to change if he was giving them the opportunity to gaze upon him as if his story was one of great beauty, even in its tragedy. His story was one of great beauty, even in its tragedy. We dwell, we gaze, and we inquire. I've really benefited from the work of Eugene Peterson and his writing and his invitation that we consider that we live and serve a God who can take it. And what we want is to be in a space and a place where we can name what our longings are and name what our griefs are, and nobody's going to leave the room. And we want to be able to inquire about absolutely anything and not be shamed in the process. And we want to know that even if we don't get what we're asking for, the people can still say that what you're asking for is something that I totally get, and I'm not going to leave the room in the process. And so my sense is that what we're really trying to do here throughout the course of our day is that we are really asking the question, what do we need to do to create outposts of goodness and beauty where we live? And in the course of doing the mental health work that we're doing, we're trying to have a vision for what that outpost of goodness and beauty looks like, and we've named some of those things by first naming what the mind is, and then describing what does an integrated mind look like. What does it mean for us to deal with trauma? What does it mean for us to think about a biopsychosocial spiritual model? What does it mean for us to deal with shame in the process of all this? In order for us to then really functionally create the kinds of communities that in the course of their being known deeply are not just feeling better, right? Because we don't want people who just feel better. We want people who, when they do feel like they're supposed to feel, are living into the world, doing the things they were made to do, creating the things that they were made to create. And my hope is that at the end of our time today, you'll be more inspired to go home and do the work that is required that enables us to do that.